Welcome to Infidelity Diaries. Explore the secrets and stories of infidelity with us. My life has always reminded me of a symphony. When I was younger, it had all the notes, loud and soft, fast and slow, harmonious and dissonant. Anthony was my conductor, and together we created this masterpiece. Back then, I truly believed that our melody would never fade. But something went wrong. Over time, the music began to disappear, leaving behind emptiness. One day, I realized that all I could hear now was silence, with us both simply existing, without rhythm and without movement. Anthony kept coming home from work, sinking into his routine, unaware of how this emptiness was growing inside me. Our conversations had long lost their meaning. We exchanged words like familiar rituals, but I hadn't heard anything real in his voice for a long time. It was like a radio playing in the background, just noise that no longer caught my attention. One evening, I stepped outside late, when everything around had already drifted into a half sleep. The wind swayed the trees, the coolness of the night reminding me that autumn was approaching. I stood on the porch and looked at our garden, the very garden into which I had once poured my heart. Back then, it symbolized something more than just a piece of land with flowers. It was the space where Anthony and I built our life, our future. But now even it looked like an old memory, faded with time. And then I heard a quiet sound, a melody, not loud or sharp, but like a distant piano chord, barely caught in the wind. I froze. In that moment, I felt like a character in a book, standing at the threshold of something new, as if before a crossroads, where one path led back to the old, familiar life, and the other, to the unknown. I looked around, and my gaze fell on the house across the street. The light from the neighbors' windows illuminated the dark yard. And there, on the porch, sat Brian, our new neighbor, whom I hardly knew. He was playing the piano. I hadn't expected to see him there, especially so late. His figure was blurred in the light, but the music, it was crystal clear. I couldn't take my eyes off him. It was that moment when something inside me resonated with each note. It wasn't just sound, it was the revival of something long lost. And that night, I suddenly realized there was still music inside me, and it was bursting out, despite the years of silence. The next day, I ran into him by chance. He was standing by his house, talking on the phone when I walked by. I noticed him out of the corner of my eye, but wasn't planning to stop. However, something changed. He looked up, and our eyes met. In that moment, like a magnet, I felt a strange pull. "Hi," he said, lowering the phone and taking a step toward me. "Hi," I replied, trying not to reveal my embarrassment. His smile wasn't just friendly, it was something else, deeper, as if there was a question hidden behind it, one I hadn't yet found an answer to myself. "Were you playing yesterday?" I suddenly asked, not knowing why this question slipped from my lips. He paused for a second, then nodded. "Yeah, you heard?" I nodded back, and a strange silence hung between us. It was like a conversation on another level, as if the question already contained some unspoken subtext that we both understood but didn't voice. "You know," he started, "I haven't played for someone in a long time. It's like a diary. You don't write it for anyone to read. Sometimes you just need to let something out." I didn't know how to respond. His words struck a chord in me, as if I had heard a truth I had long been hiding from myself. "Music. It's like an echo," he continued, leaning on the porch railing. "It gives you back something you haven't felt in a long time. Sometimes you don't even know you've lost it until you hear it again." I was silent, trying to absorb his words. He was talking about music, but I heard something more. It was like a conversation about life, a life that was once full but had drained over time, leaving only a shadow of what had once meant everything. "Have you ever felt that?" he asked. "Felt what exactly?" I replied, trying not to show my confusion. The feeling that you've lost something but can't figure out what, and only when it comes back do you realize how much you missed it. I looked at him for a long time before I could say anything. Yes, I have, I said quietly. In that moment, I felt that my life, the one I had built over the years, was turning into something else, and that other life was calling me toward it. I couldn't say for certain when it all began. Maybe it was when our house finally sank into silence, or maybe it was earlier, the first time I noticed how my steps slowed near Brian's windows. I don't know. It all happened so gradually that I barely caught the beginning. But now, every time I stepped outside to get some fresh air, I found myself looking for him. We started crossing paths more often. Sometimes it was a glance across the street. Other times, short phrases or exchanged smiles. But each time, it felt like there was something more behind these meetings than just pleasantries. As if, in these fleeting moments, I was searching for an answer to a question I couldn't even ask myself. One evening, as I was walking through the yard, Brian came out to his car. His dog joyfully jumped around him, and when he saw me, he waved, inviting me over. I didn't immediately realize I was walking toward him, as if my legs were moving on their own. Hi, Sarah. His voice was as warm as the evening air, so casual that I immediately felt at ease. Hi, Brian, I replied as I came closer. His dog was already circling around my feet, and I absently petted her. We stood there, as if it was the most natural thing in the world. I caught myself no longer being scared of these brief encounters. On the contrary, I had started looking forward to them. Inside me, a feeling was growing that I couldn't quite describe, a mix of lightness and yet some strange tension, as if there was an invisible spark in the air between us. You know, Brian began, squinting slightly against the setting sun. My wife and I made a little spot in the backyard. Maybe you could come over sometime? We could sit and chat? I nodded, though I didn't know what to say. Something inside me had already accepted his invitation, but there were also those unspeakable fears I had long pushed deep down. Perhaps it was just friendliness, perhaps something more. But everything seemed so innocent that I couldn't find anything dangerous in it, at least not at that moment. We entered the yard, and I immediately noticed how cozy they had made it. Small chairs, lanterns, flowers hanging in pots along the wall. Everything seemed so simple, yet intimate. It was their world, and I had been invited into this hidden part of Brian's life, away from prying eyes. We sat down, and the conversation flowed easily, almost on its own. About our families, about how everything began. He told me how he and his wife had moved here in search of peace. I answered his questions, feeling that some common theme was emerging between us, as if our lives were somehow similar. But I knew it was just an illusion, because behind this simplicity, there was always something deeper, something we weren't saying. Sometimes it feels like we're all playing this game. Perfect homes, perfect families, he said, looking at the lantern lights. And inside, every day can look completely different. His words touched me. He didn't say anything extraordinary, but at that moment, I felt like his thoughts aligned with mine. It was like a quiet whisper inside me, the one I had been trying to ignore. Yes, I answered, barely holding back from revealing too much. On the outside, everything seems so simple, so stable. But inside, everyone has their own struggle. He looked at me, and in his gaze, I saw not just interest, but something more. As if he understood something I wasn't ready to admit to myself. It was the moment when an electric spark seemed to pass between us, sudden and unpredictable. I felt the tension growing, but I couldn't stop it. It was as if something in this situation was pulling me in like a magnet. It was a new feeling, almost imperceptible, but I knew it was growing with every conversation. I thought it was just friendship, just mutual understanding, but somewhere deep inside, I knew there was something more. The evening dragged on, and our conversation became lighter, yet more intense, as if we both knew there was more behind the words. We didn't say it out loud, but it was in every gesture, in every look. When I returned home, I sat on the terrace for a long time, looking at our house, at the silence that once again enveloped me like a thick blanket. I realized that these meetings with Brian had become more than just conversations for me. I was waiting for them. It felt like I was reaching for something long forgotten, something I had been missing. It was like a breath of fresh air after being trapped in a confined space for too long. Anthony still didn't notice anything. He would come home from work, immersed in his tasks, and didn't see how I began to look for excuses to go outside, how I checked the time to meet Brian again. It had become my new habit, hidden but so necessary. And every time, I felt something dangerous growing inside me, but all the more irresistible. I kept returning to the thought that it was just innocent conversation, but inside, something protested. I felt the sparks between us growing stronger each day, and while I tried to convince myself that it was just a game, I knew, deep down inside, this fire was burning brighter and brighter. This evening turned out unusually warm for autumn. The leaves had already begun to yellow, reminding me of the approaching winter, but the air was soft, as if nature had decided to linger on the edge of the seasons for just a moment longer. We met again in Brian's backyard. Everything was the same lanterns, the same light conversations. But something inside me had changed. I felt it from the first minutes. Every conversation between us now was threaded with what remained unsaid. Brian seemed to sense it too, though he acted as if nothing was happening. But I knew, beneath the surface, something greater was lurking. We sat in our chairs like before, but the silence between us was different now. It seemed to breathe, swell, filling the space around us. I couldn't focus on his words. At some point, I simply stopped listening and allowed myself to dive into that silence. My thoughts wandered somewhere between reality and fantasy, where we were not just neighbors, not just acquaintances. Then the rain began to drizzle. Light, almost imperceptible. The drops slowly trickled down the branches of the trees, as if cautiously exploring the ground beneath them. Brian stood up and suggested we go under the porch roof to shelter from the rain. I nodded, though I knew this gesture was something more than just an attempt to avoid the rain. In that moment, every step was bringing me closer to something I could no longer turn away from. Under the porch, it was cozy. The soft light from the lanterns illuminated us, and the sound of the rain became a backdrop to what was about to happen. We kept talking, but our words grew less meaningful, quieter, as if they themselves understood their irrelevance. Brian seemed to feel the change too. His voice became softer, his gaze more focused. He no longer looked away, and his eyes caught mine, not letting go. Then everything went still. Our voices disappeared, leaving us alone with this silence. It hung between us like an invisible thread, stretched to its limit. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, my thoughts swirling in a chaotic mess. Everything was happening so slowly that I could literally feel each moment. It was like a prolonged pause before something inevitable. I remember looking into his eyes. His gaze was deep, so calm, but at the same time unsettling, like the water before a storm. It was a moment when words no longer mattered. Everything that was happening between us no longer needed explanations. Time seemed to freeze. I felt something new being born in that silence, and though I knew it was dangerous, I could no longer resist. I stepped toward him. It was almost an instinctive movement, without hesitation, without extra thoughts. My body knew what to do before I even realized it. We were now only a breath apart. His eyes met mine, and that was it. In that moment, we ceased to be just two people sitting on a porch. Everything changed. The first kiss was quiet, like the rain still falling behind us. It was a confession that everything I had tried to hide from myself was true, and it was already unstoppable. Sarah, he whispered, as if not knowing what to say next. His voice was as quiet as the kiss, but the lightness that was once there was gone. I didn't answer. I was too scared even to think about what it meant. My mind was in chaos, and the taste of something I couldn't describe still lingered on my lips. It was something forbidden, yet so real that I couldn't ignore it. We stood in silence, listening to the rain growing stronger. In that moment, I realized we had crossed a line that could never be erased. We both knew it, but neither of us dared to say it out loud. I turned toward the door, feeling the air grow too heavy. Inside me was a storm of emotions: fear, guilt, desire, all tangled into a knot I couldn't untie. But I knew one thing: things would never be the same again. When I returned home after that night, my head was overflowing with thoughts, as if hundreds of shards had been thrown in, each one cutting me from the inside. I tried to convince myself that it was a mistake, an accident, that we could undo it all, but it was impossible. How can you forget something that turns your world upside down? How can you pretend it never happened? Even when I closed my eyes, I saw his gaze, felt his lips on mine. Inside, everything was so loud that it felt like I was standing on the edge of some catastrophe. Anthony was at home, as usual, immersed in his work, not even noticing my late return. I looked at him and thought, how can I continue living this life when everything inside me has changed? He didn't notice anything. His world remained the same, but mine had collapsed. The next morning, I tried to act like nothing had happened. I made breakfast, cleaned up, but every time I accidentally glanced out the window, I didn't just see Brian's house. I saw a possibility. A possibility to break free from the prison of routine, from this drawn-out pause in which I had been living for years. It seemed like everything around me whispered, "You can go back to your usual life. Pretend nothing happened." But those whispers were weaker than what I felt inside. I didn't know what to do with this new feeling. It was like a fire burning inside me, and I couldn't put it out. That day, I decided I needed to give myself time. Maybe I just needed to figure things out. Perhaps it was just a spark, a moment of weakness, and in a few days it would pass. But it didn't pass. I tried not to cross paths with Brian. I deliberately left the house at different times, avoided looking at his house, but my steps, as if not obeying me, kept leading me back. Every day, I found myself trapped in this feeling again and again, like being drawn to a magnet. I knew he felt it too. We spoke little, almost nothing, but every glance, every pause, every fleeting touch, they spoke for us. One day, I ran into him on the street. I had just gone out for a walk, but as soon as I saw him, my heart tightened. We couldn't just pass by each other without stopping. "Hi." His voice was as calm as always, but I caught something new in it. Something quiet, but insistent. "Hi," I replied, trying to keep the tremor out of my voice. We stood facing each other, and it felt like an invisible thread was stretched between us. I tried to smile, but inside I was being torn apart. "Is everything okay?" he asked, his eyes searching mine intently. "Yes," I lied, because I couldn't tell the truth. "How can you say that you no longer know who you are? Do you want to talk?" He took a step closer, and with each of his steps, I felt my own walls crumbling. "I don't know what to say, Brian." I lowered my eyes, trying to hide my feelings. "Everything has become so complicated." "Complicated?" His voice was soft, but I could hear the concern in it. "I've been thinking about it too, Sarah. I can't get it out of my head. Do you understand?" I nodded without lifting my gaze. Of course, I understood. Every time I looked at him, I felt the same thing: the impossibility of going back. "We can't pretend that nothing happened," he continued, his voice quieter, almost a whisper. "This has changed both of us. You feel it too, right?" I lifted my eyes and met his gaze. Yes, I felt it, but that knowledge scared me more than anything else. I understood that it would only get harder from here, but everything inside me was pulling me toward him, as if I was trapped in this desire. "I don't know what to do," I said, and those were the most honest words I could say. He looked at me. His gaze was warm, but there was something more in it: regret, understanding, and desire. "You're not alone in this," he said quietly but firmly. "We'll figure it out together." I didn't know what to reply. I stood before him, feeling my heart pounding, feeling everything inside me scream from the tension, but I couldn't take a step back. I was bound by this silent contract we had made that night, and it was already impossible to undo it. We stood there for several more minutes, in silence, but that silence was filled with meaning. It didn't need words. We both already knew that from here on, we would only move forward, though neither of us understood where exactly. When I returned home, Anthony still didn't notice anything. I looked at him, and now his usual behavior seemed so foreign to me. He lived in his own world, where there was no place for my feelings, my doubts. I realized that I had already crossed the line beyond which my former life seemed like just a memory. Now I was looking for any excuse to see Brian. It had become not just a desire, but a real need. Meeting him was like a breath of fresh air, saving me from the suffocating routine. Everything that once seemed so stable now appeared like a mosaic, ready to fall apart. And each of our meetings reminded me that I no longer belonged to the world where everything was fine. I started finding excuses to leave the house. At first, they were small errands, picking something up from the store, meeting a friend for coffee. But then our meetings became more frequent and in more secluded places. We met around the corner from my house, hiding behind cars. Sometimes I crossed the street and found myself in that very backyard where it all began. But the most thrilling times were spent by the sea. We found quiet spots nearby, where there wasn't a soul. There, among the sound of the waves, our conversations grew more intimate. Every interaction between us was filled with a hidden tension. It used to be a light attraction, but now it had deepened. It was as if we could no longer keep the distance between us, even when we weren't touching. Brian had a way of listening like no one else. I told him things I would never dare say out loud with Anthony. I spoke about my fears, about feeling trapped in my marriage, as if life had turned into a script I was blindly following. "I don't know when it all became like this," I once told him, sitting on the sand by the sea. "It seemed like everything was fine. But then, it just became quiet, as if I disappeared." "Have you ever thought that maybe it's not your fault?" Brian replied, his voice full of gentle compassion. "You deserve more, Sarah, more than just quiet." "But what if this is all I'm capable of?" I turned away, feeling the familiar heaviness rising in my chest. "Maybe the problem is me?" He was silent for a while, then his hand gently touched mine. "It's not you." His words sounded almost like a promise. "You're alive, Sarah. You feel, and that's the most important thing." I looked at his hand, how it lay on mine, and felt a wave of tenderness wash over me. His words resonated so deeply within me that I couldn't ignore them, but I was still confused, torn between reality and what was beginning to feel real. I felt like I was drowning in this feeling, but every moment with him felt right. Right, despite everything I was leaving behind. It became harder with Anthony. I tried to pretend that nothing was happening, but he started to notice the changes. My absences became too frequent, my answers more vague. He began to ask cautious questions. "Are you looking for something, Sarah?" He asked one evening when I was late coming home from one of our meetings again. "No, I just went for a walk, got some fresh air," I replied, avoiding his gaze. He looked at me for a long time, his eyes seemingly searching for something I couldn't find myself. Then he slowly nodded, but I knew that his suspicions were growing. Nevertheless, he didn't ask any direct questions yet, and I continued to play my part. Each evening, coming home after our meetings, I looked at Anthony and realized I was playing with fire. But something inside me had already made the decision for me. Thoughts that once seemed abstract were turning into actions. This was no longer a fantasy or a light flirtation. Brian and I had crossed the line, and every conversation we had confirmed it. We started talking not just about our lives, but about how they could be different, about how we could live otherwise if we had the chance. These conversations grew more and more candid, and I began to catch myself thinking that these words were not just dreams. I could no longer ignore the fact that the person next to me seemed to know me better than anyone else. One evening, when we met in the backyard again, Brian suddenly looked at me with such an expression that I froze. "Sarah," he began quietly, "how much longer are we going to hide?" I didn't know what to say. His question hung in the air like lightning before a storm. This was the moment when my thoughts finally turned into actions. We could no longer pretend that these were just innocent meetings. We could no longer pretend that this was a temporary infatuation. I felt everything around us heating up as we sank deeper into something that could no longer be stopped. "I don't know," I whispered, "but I can't go back." He nodded silently, and in his gaze, I saw the same determination I felt within myself. We both knew this wasn't just a feeling, it was more than we could control. Anthony unexpectedly suggested having dinner with Brian and his wife. I was standing by the stove when he walked into the kitchen with the suggestion, sounding as if he had decided to invite old friends over. "What do you think, Sarah? We haven't gathered with the neighbors in a while, and Brian and his wife are pleasant people," he said, tasting the sauce with a spoon as if it was the most ordinary conversation. "Let's invite them over for dinner." My hand froze above the pot. My heart sank. Inside, everything boiled with fear and confusion, but I tried not to show my emotions. "Dinner?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm, though inside, a storm was raging. "Yes, why not? We hardly interact with them. It's a good chance to strengthen our connection." I smiled, but it was a strained, almost artificial smile. All I could think at that moment was that it was a trap. Did he know something? Or was this just a coincidence? An awkward and terrifying coincidence? "Of course, that sounds wonderful," I replied, feeling the icy fear engulf me. The entire day, I was in a state of tense anticipation. My thoughts were jumbled, images flashed before my eyes. Brian, his gaze, our meetings. How would we sit at the same table with Anthony and his wife? Could I pretend that nothing had happened between us? What if Anthony already suspected something? My head throbbed with all these questions, and I couldn't find an answer to any of them. By the evening, Brian and his wife, Martha, appeared at our doorstep. My blood froze when I saw him. The same familiar look, the same slight smile. But behind that external composure, I saw the same tension that tormented me. "Sarah, Anthony, thank you for the invitation," Martha cheerfully said as she entered the house with a bottle of wine. "Glad to see you," Anthony replied, embracing them both as if they were old friends. I forced a smile, feeling like I was walking on thin ice, about to crack beneath me. We sat down at the table, and the dinner began. The first few minutes passed in polite conversations. Anthony talked about work, Brian laughed at some story, and Martha kept the conversation going. But I could barely speak. Inside, I was tense to the limit. I couldn't look at Brian, but I could feel his eyes on me. And every time our eyes accidentally met, there were so many questions in his gaze. It was as if he was trying to understand how we ended up in this situation and how we were going to get out of it. "Sarah, you're quiet today," Anthony suddenly said, placing his hand on my shoulder. "Are you all right?" "Yes, everything's fine. Just a little tired," I replied, trying to smile. But inside, everything was turning upside down. It felt like I could break down at any moment. At some point, I finally caught Brian's gaze. He was looking at me without turning away. I saw something more than just politeness in his eyes. There was hidden tension, unresolved questions that we couldn't answer. He, too, felt that we were walking a dangerous line. "Brian, tell us how things are going at work." Anthony turned to him, unaware of the tension in the air or the silent exchange of looks. "Oh, it's the same as always. Nothing too exciting, Brian smiled, but I could see that his usual lightness was disturbed. He took a sip of wine, and I realized that his nerves were also stretched thin. The whole evening, I felt like I was walking through a minefield where any word could trigger a disaster. I found myself no longer listening to the conversations around the table. My internal monologue ran parallel to reality, where I tried to figure out what would happen next. Could I survive this evening? Anthony was completely calm, his laughter echoing over the table, but I knew this couldn't last forever. When dinner was over, I couldn't take it anymore. I stood up from the table under the pretext of clearing the dishes. I felt like I couldn't stay around them any longer, around Brian, in this unbearable atmosphere of secrecy and fear. Sarah, wait! Let me help! Brian suddenly offered, getting up from the table. No, it's all right, I replied, but he had already approached me. We stepped into the kitchen, and I froze when he gently touched my arm. Sarah, are you okay? His voice was quiet, and in it, I heard the same tension I felt inside myself. I sighed, unable to meet his eyes. No, I whispered. I don't know how much longer I can go on like this. He fell silent, understanding what I meant. We both knew this couldn't last forever. But what to do next? I didn't have an answer, and he couldn't offer one. All that was left was to continue living with this weight until the ice beneath us finally cracked. The evening ended as unexpectedly as it began. No one suspected anything. Martha and Brian said their goodbyes, and Anthony, as if nothing had happened, returned to his routine. But I knew it was only a matter of time. I thought everything would settle down after dinner. Anthony was so calm that I almost convinced myself, maybe I'm just complicating things, maybe he really doesn't know anything. But the calm was an illusion. In a few days, his behavior started to change. It was subtle, but noticeable. His gaze became more intense, his questions more cautious. It was as if he was circling around me, testing me, as if I were someone he had known for a long time, but now began doubting his knowledge. One evening, as we were sitting at dinner, he suddenly spoke. Sarah, it seems to me that you've changed lately, he said calmly, continuing to cut his food. You've changed somehow? Don't you feel it yourself? I froze. Those words pierced me like an icy blade. I wanted to respond calmly, but my heart raced so fast that the words got stuck in my throat. Changed? I repeated, trying not to reveal the panic in my voice. No, nothing like that. Maybe you're just exaggerating. He lifted his gaze to me, and in his eyes, I saw something new. Not just suspicion, but almost certainty. He already knew, suspected something, but wasn't fully ready to admit it yet. I don't think it's an exaggeration. His voice was quiet, but full of confidence. I feel like something's wrong between us. My hand trembled as I reached for my glass of water. My attempt to lie was so clumsy that I felt how my voice betrayed me. Anthony, everything's fine, I said, trying to avoid his gaze. I've just got a lot going on, a little tired, that's all. But I knew it wasn't convincing. He was watching me, and I could see that his attention was now completely focused on me. It was as if I had become a puzzle to him, one he couldn't solve, and the more he looked at me, the more he understood that something was wrong. Are you sure? He asked with a slight smile, but there was a quiet beat of distrust in his voice. I nodded, trying not to meet his eyes, and then it hit me. He no longer believed me. I felt like a rabbit caught in headlights, knowing that one more step and I'd fall into a trap. But he didn't press, as if testing how far I was willing to go to shatter the fragile mask we both still wore. All right, he finally said, putting his fork aside. If you say so. He didn't continue the conversation, and I sighed with relief, but I knew that this was just the beginning. His attention was now fixed on me, as if I were an unknown enemy. Every glance, every movement, reminded me that we no longer lived in a familiar world of trust. I tried to behave as usual, but inside, Everything was falling apart. For several days, I tried to convince myself that nothing was happening. I continued with my usual routines, as if nothing had changed. But his intense attention was killing me. He started to notice every step I took, every little detail. How I lingered outside, how long I talked on the phone, how I avoided his gaze when he asked about my plans for the evening. It was as if we were playing a game of chess, where every move could lead to discovery. One evening, I was sitting in the living room with my phone in hand when he entered the room and quietly stood beside me. "Who are you talking to?" His voice came unexpectedly, and before I could hide the screen, I too hastily shoved the phone into my pocket. "Just chatting with a friend," I answered too quickly, and I realized how foolish it sounded. He slowly approached me, sat down on the couch next to me, and looked straight into my eyes. "Sarah, are you hiding something?" he asked quietly, but with such confidence that I felt the ground beneath me start to shake. In that moment, I knew that lying again would be almost impossible. He was so close, and his gaze pierced right through me. I couldn't escape, couldn't hide behind made-up excuses. "No," I replied, but my voice trembled. "Are you sure?" he asked again, not breaking eye contact. "Yes." I tried to gather all my strength to hold it together, but inside, everything was cracking at the seams. He stared at me for a few more seconds, then stood up and walked towards the door. "All right," he said calmly, as if nothing had happened. But there was something in his tone that made me realize this conversation was just the beginning of something bigger, and if I didn't handle it, everything would collapse. I sat on the couch, clutching my phone in my hands, and felt everything inside me gradually fall apart. His suspicions were like a blade, slowly but surely cutting through the truth. And all I could do was wait for the moment when he'd take his next step. Anthony began his investigation quietly, without asking unnecessary questions or making comments. I could see it in his gaze, in the way he watched every move I made. He didn't ask directly, but his silent presence became unbearable. He started noticing everything, every little detail I used to dismiss as coincidence. I was sure he felt something, but I kept pretending. With each passing day, pretending became harder. One day, I left my phone in the kitchen while I went out for groceries. When I returned, I noticed it wasn't lying the way I had left it. The screen was locked, but the feeling that someone had touched it wouldn't leave me. Maybe it was just paranoia, but deep down, I knew. Anthony was checking on me. He didn't make scenes, didn't openly express suspicion, but I could feel his distrust in everything. He watched me, and with each day, his silence grew more oppressive. I tried to maintain normalcy, but inside, I was panicking. Every time I went to meet Brian, I came up with excuses. I tried to be as careful as possible. We chose quiet places where no one could see us. But one day, everything went wrong. It was just an ordinary day. I met Brian near the beach, where we could talk quietly. There were no signs that anyone had seen us. We were just there, like two people who happened to run into each other. But when I got home, I noticed that Anthony was already there. He was standing by the window, looking outside. I froze in the doorway, feeling something unsettling in his gaze. "Hi," I said, trying to hide my unease. "Hi," he replied without turning around. I set my bag on the floor and walked over to him. His face remained calm, but there was something tense in his posture, as if a storm was raging inside him that he was carefully hiding. "How was your day?" I asked, trying to sound casual. He finally turned to face me, meeting my eyes. His gaze was cold, but not angry. It was something worse. It was the look of someone who knew, but wasn't ready to reveal it. "Fine," he answered with a smile, but I sensed that the smile was forced. Fake. "And yours?" I froze for a moment. His question was simple, but I knew there was something more behind it. Inside, everything tightened. "Fine too," I answered, trying to conceal the tremor in my voice. He nodded, but his eyes remained locked on me. That look was penetrating, piercing, and I felt uneasy under his watchful gaze. The next day, Anthony still didn't say anything, but his silence was worse than any outburst. I knew he suspected something, but he continued to play this game. I felt like he was waiting for something, some mistake on my part. I didn't know what he had seen, what he had noticed, but his behavior was becoming more and more alarming. He didn't cause scenes, didn't make harsh remarks, but every movement of his told me he was watching me. One day, I went outside to briefly meet Brian. It was a quick encounter. We stood by his car, talking about trivial matters. It all looked innocent, but at that moment, I didn't know I was being watched. When I returned home, Anthony was there again, in the same spot by the window. His silence was so thick, it felt like it was pressing down on me with each passing second. That evening, as we sat down for dinner, he was sitting across from me, and the silence between us became unbearable. "Sarah," he suddenly said quietly, breaking the silence. I looked up, my heart sinking. "Yes?" I responded, trying to stay calm. "You met Brian today, didn't you?" His voice was calm, almost indifferent, but I sensed hidden steel in his tone. It was like a jolt of electricity hit me. I didn't know what he had seen, or how much he knew, but his question was direct, and I couldn't avoid answering. "Yes, I ran into him on the street," I replied, pretending it was an insignificant event. "Ran into him?" His gaze pierced through me, as if trying to reach the truth. I couldn't speak. Inside, everything was trembling. I felt like every word I said could lead to disaster. But he fell silent again, set his fork down, and continued eating as if nothing had happened. That silence was worse than shouting. I knew he was planning something, but I didn't know what. At that moment, I realized he knows more than he's letting on. I came home late in the evening, trying to hide my anxiety as always. The door softly clicked shut behind me, and the familiar silence of the house immediately enveloped me like a thick blanket. I placed my bag on the chair in the hallway, trying not to think about the one question that had been haunting me the entire time. How much longer would this game last? That evening, I didn't hear Anthony's footsteps. Usually, his presence was felt in everything, in the way he moved quietly around the house, in the muted light filtering from his office. But this time, it felt different. At first, I thought he might still be at work, but when I turned toward the bedroom door, I saw him there, standing silently by a suitcase that lay open on the bed. My blood froze. Anthony stood with his back to me, but every movement he made was precise, methodical. He was packing his things, as if it wasn't just an act of leaving, but some kind of ritual he had carefully planned. For a few moments, I couldn't move, as if the image of him with the suitcase in front of me had paralyzed me. "Anthony!" My own name echoed faintly, weak and trembling. He didn't turn around. He kept folding his clothes, his hands moving calmly, without any sharp motions. Inside, everything was churning, and I couldn't understand what was happening. Fear slowly rose from the depths of my being. "Anthony, what are you doing?" I finally asked, though I already knew the answer. Silence. His silence, like a sharp blade, pierced the air. He finished folding a shirt, gently placed it in the suitcase, and zipped it up. When he finally turned to face me, his expression was cold, like the autumn wind blowing outside the windows. No emotion, just emptiness. That emptiness terrified me more than if he had started yelling or causing a scene. "It's over, Sarah," he said quietly, but every sound of his voice seemed to explode in my head. Those words hung in the air, and I suddenly felt the world around me collapsing. He didn't say anything more, but I didn't need any explanations. Everything was written in his eyes, in his cold, distant stare. He didn't need answers anymore. He knew everything. I stepped forward, not knowing what to say. Inside, everything screamed, "Explain yourself, justify, say something." But the words were stuck in my throat like stones, each one heavier than the last. Anthony, wait! I finally said, but even to myself it sounded pitiful. No, he cut me off, without raising his voice. It's over, Sarah. I've seen everything. Those words sounded like a sentence, one from which there was no escape. I felt my heart tighten as emptiness grew inside me. Everything I had wanted to say, everything that had built up inside, all my excuses, it all became meaningless. No words could change what had already happened. I didn't. I tried to start, but he stopped me again. I saw it all, Sarah. Don't. It doesn't matter anymore. He picked up the suitcase and slowly moved toward the door without looking at me. My heart was screaming. I wanted to run to him, to stop him, but something inside me broke. I knew I had lost him. I had lost everything, and there was no fixing it. When the door closed behind him, I stood in silence. The house felt cold, empty, like the vacuum of space, where there's no air, no life. I stared at the closed door, and tears began to roll down my cheeks, but I didn't even try to stop them. I had lost everything,